the economy certainly benefits from, labor market churn, from sharing of information, from that knowledge sharing, from the ability to truly compete and for workers to move, at their will. We know that this raises wages, among other, positive effects. And so non-competes severely limit, especially now as we understand how prevalent they have become. In addition to the statistics that Ryan mentioned about low-wage workers and their prevalence there, I think the best estimates that we have is that at least 20% of the entire workforce is currently covered by a non-compete agreement, and up to 40% have potentially been covered by non-competes or have signed a non-compete at some point in their career. So these are becoming quite pervasive uses within employment contracts, alongside maybe some of the other restrictive covenants that we may cover. But I think generally non-competes are often constructed in an overly broad manner that becomes quite harmful, for workers. Whereas there are other restrictive covenants that could be more narrowly tailored, such as an NDA or a non-solicitation agreement, or a trade secrets law, which is an entire body of law to protect exactly, what non-competes were actually kind of originally intended to do. In the state of Minnesota, and I'll certainly defer to Chris a lot on this, since you've directly worked on cases related to Minnesota non-competes. But generally, the state has non-competes are enforceable. Though I do think that in the courts, they're generally looked down upon if they're constructed in an overly broad manner. But there has been recent legislation. I know we'll get into a lot more of the general reform efforts that we've been seeing both in the state and across the country, and at the federal level. But even just this past legislative session, there was a bill introduced to restrict the use of non-competes, generally restricting the scope of them toward so low and moderate wage workers would be exempt essentially from non-competes, and for non-competes that were enforced, that garden leave provision, which essentially means that up to about 50%, I think in the Minnesota law, 50% of that worker's salary who was covered by a non-compete would have to be paid over the 2-year time frame, that the non-compete would be in effect. So that, of course, disincentivizes employers, from using these, or at least mitigates some of the negative impacts that the worker may feel when they leave that firm, to work elsewhere. So that's it did not, I should say, it did not pass, so it was not enacted, but did make it through one House committee, was referred to another, and I think the Senate version of that did not move forward as far as I could tell. But so that's kind of where we are, the state of play here in Minnesota as well.
Thank you, Catherine. As we're continuing to just kind of get oriented with this set of issues, I want to turn to you, Aaron, and say, your research has covered a pretty wide variety of topics that matter for low-income workers and families. So unions, labor market concentration, early childhood development, and now restrictive covenants in the labor market. You've engaged in public service at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, as well as worker advocacy. And given that background, I'm curious, what is it that drew you to work on these topics?
So, yeah, broadly, I think working families in America have been struggling, especially working families that include people with a lot of formal education, have been struggling to maintain a foothold in the economy and live the American dream. And I think there's a lot of pressures that have been pushing down on their success. And so I think there's, I've worked on a lot of different policy areas that are promising to try to create some upward pressure for them. And yeah, I remember, so echoing what Ryan said earlier, a few years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, like this set of issues really wasn't on the labor economics, labor policy radar. It was real in the economy, but it's not something that we were collecting data on. It wasn't there's no central registry for these kinds of private contracts. So they're really hard to observe and really hard to study and hard to build knowledge about, because again, it requires seeing into millions of private agreements, which you can't. And I remember meeting Evan Starr when he was a PhD student who went on to, he kind of pushed this issue onto the agenda with his research, and a lot of and others, but he was one of the key people. And he was telling me about his dissertation. Like, I was like, that is crazy. Like, how can they have a provision in there that prevents you from, like, after they've fired you, or after you've quit, like, how do they still bind you to like not take a job with another employer in the community? Like, you've built up your professional skills, you've built up your expertise and your reputation through a lot of labor and study, and now they're saying like you have to move out of the state to take a job and support your family, like, or take a big pay cut and like shift to a totally different kind of work. Like, that doesn't make any sense in a competitive labor market. As an economist, we think competition cures a lot of problems. More competition, more competitive pressure can push up working conditions and wages, job quality. And here's like something that's like hidden force that's just like suppressing that competition. And I don't know about you, like, I try to be pretty diligent when I read long contracts or I'm presented with long contracts. But, I just took a new job a few months ago. I will confess, I did not read every word of, every paper that they put in front of me. And a lot of these, when you start a job, you get bound to a long list of terms. And a lot of employers just, as a total pro forma, have language in there that says you won't, you're bound, you're restricted from being able to compete against us in the future in this way. Workers don't even know they're signing it. They're certainly not, sometimes they're presented with it after they've started the job. So it wasn't part of the initial bargaining. It's just like, oh, you sign this thing, we're requiring it now. So there's a lot of ways that this gets pushed into workers' lives without them fully appreciating what it means. And then they find themselves bound on the exit agreement, say, by the way, remember, you can't take a job in this under these terms, or we're going to come after you for damages. And, Jimmy John's bound a lot of their workers, their sandwich artists, under non-compete agreements. So like, this is not a trade secret. I've worked making subs, like, that is it. There's some skill there, and there's some like, but Jimmy John's does not need non-compete agreements, but that hurts those workers. It restricts their ability to earn a living and support their families.
I'd like to just quickly underline something you said a moment ago, which is that in many states, non-competes are enforceable against workers who have been laid off without cause in their states. And it's my understanding that includes Minnesota. But now I want to turn to you, Chris, and kind of talk about some more of what Catherine and Aaron were talking about with regard to kind of how this plays out for workers in practice. And you bring an important perspective to this as someone who's actually represented workers with non-compete contracts. So I'm curious how you've seen employers using non-competes and what kinds of situations might result in an employer at least threatening to enforce a non-compete, whether or not they actually engage in any litigation.
Sure. So for most of my over 35 years in practice, I actually enforced non-competes. And probably in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been on kind of a crusade. I'm getting older and more in the twilight of my career, so I have the luxury of being able to do more of what I want. And I saw how unfair these contracts are to a lot of employees. Like Aaron said, I'd say well over 90% of the employees that come to see me had no idea what they signed at the beginning of the employment. Everything's rosy. They want the job, and they pretty much sign anything that's in front of them. And then they contact me and say, what did I sign? What did I get myself into? Like I said, about 5 or 6 years ago, I put a simple ad up on Google, if you typed in non-compete attorney MN, I'd be the top search result. I charge a flat $350, which is a steep discount off my obscenely high corporate rate. I picked that amount because it just felt like an amount that most employees could afford and make them feel like they have a little bit of skin in the game, but not be prohibitively expensive. And so I sit with them usually for about an hour and a half. And, when they come in, they're scared. They don't know what they've got themselves into, like I said, and I'd say almost without exception by the end of my time with them, if nothing else, they just feel that they thank me and say, I feel so much better just being able to sit with you and understand, what I got into. And I offer options along a risk continuum from most risky to least risky. And we work together to figure out, where are you along that continuum? And we come up with a strategy. Usually they're either leaving a job voluntarily or they've been fired. Minnesota is a state where simply because you've been fired doesn't mean that the non-compete is unenforceable. And so we figure out, what are their options? And a lot of times there aren't a lot of options. Employers are, number one, they purposely draft them over broadly because they can always narrow them once the employee leaves and if they end up being in front of a judge. They always have several provisions in them, a confidentiality provision to protect confidential information, almost always a blanket non-compete within a geographic area that says you can't compete at all, a customer non-solicitation saying you can't go after either the company's customers or the customers that the employee worked with specifically, and then you can't go after the company's employees for a period of a year or more. And then what is really meant as a deterrent is that there's a provision saying if the company sues you, former employee, and we win, you have to pay not only your own attorney's fees, but you have to pay our attorney's fees as well. And as a practical matter, most employees, they can't afford their own attorney. They certainly can't afford to pay the employer's attorney's fees. And so a lot of times what happens is that just the existence of the non-compete or the non-solicitation itself is enough of a deterrent for the employee to have to go find something else, either in a different geographic area or sometimes even in a different industry. And the idea, of starting from scratch is really not fair, but sometimes that's what they're faced with.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little about what alternatives there might be to non-competes. As we think about where employers with legitimate interests might be able to use some other mechanism that is perhaps less damaging than non-competes are. For anyone here, I'm curious where you see those opportunities to have more narrowly tailored measures.
I feel like you've worked a lot on other restrictive covenants, but do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I know Aaron's done a lot of research on other forms of restrictive covenants, but yeah, I mean, generally, I think non-competes have become, as I mentioned, a blunt instrument where there could be much more narrowly tailored options that essentially achieve the same goal, which is for an employer to protect, in some cases, protect their customers, protect their intellectual property, protect their trade secrets. Those are all very valid, concerns. But there are also, customer non-solicitation clauses. There's trade secret law. There's intellectual property laws. There's other measures that can be included in a contract that would get at this same goal without having to prevent the worker on the back end, once they leave that firm, from starting their own company, from working within their same industry where they have developed this deep set of expertise, or again, having to move out of the place where they call home and where they've rooted their family. So that the negative implications of a non-compete are so outweigh, I think, the general, validity of where they can be used. And I can talk also about ways in which non-competes, if used, because as I said, there are some instances where they may make sense, but you can still either narrow the scope or provide transparency measures that are really important. because, as we've said, so many workers are, they accept the job without realizing a non-compete is part of that, or don't even find out till they have a non-compete until after they leave. That transparency would be a huge, help in just making sure that workers are more aware and prepared, before they accept a job and sign a contract. So I think there are both measures to kind of limit or narrow the scope of non-competes or make them less negative in terms of their impact on the worker. Then there are also much more tailored, I think, restrictive covenants that may make sense in certain situations that may even eliminate the need for a non-compete in certain cases as well. So,
yeah, there've been a lot of proposals made about ways to limit or create alternative ways to protect these things. And I think there's tons of them available. I think what we've seen is that, a lot of, big firms have good in-house counsel or, access to attorneys on retainer who can sort of tailor things or give them good guidance. There's really no cost. Like the reality is that there's almost no cost to like binding people to a non-compete for a firm, because it's the ink and the paper, and the PDF pixels nowadays in the contract. Like, especially most workers don't recognize that it's there. They're not able to leverage that for higher wages or something like that. So it's basically free and to bind this person. If you go to the smaller firms, maybe don't have easy access to counsel. A lot of them rely on sort of just templates for their employment contracts. If you go to the Society for Human Resource Management website, that's a professional association for human resource professionals, and you look at their their like make your own employment contract tool. They have the base contract that they offer has a very broad non-compete agreement, a very broad non-disclosure agreement, and it's written very generically, very broadly, because like they don't know the specifics of your firm, and HR people just download this thing and have people sign it, and put their firm name on it, and so this just propagates, and there's no force pushing to limit it. So requiring garden leave is, I think, has a lot of benefits, because basically it creates a cost for the employer. It says, if you want to really bind somebody to this kind of restriction, okay, if it has value to you, cool, that's great. If that's real, then share that value with the worker. And garden leave means that, like, if you're bound to a non-compete and you are abiding by it after you leave the firm, then say for a year or two, the firm is going to pay you a proportion of your salary that you would have made if you kept working. So 50%, is that example. So that says, okay, if this is a real benefit, here's a way to do it, and here's a way to share that benefit with the person who's paying the cost, who's harmed. If you're not willing to pay that garden leave, then probably there's not a real benefit. And so it kind of calls your BS. So I think those are good things. Non-disclosure agreements often get written and interpreted very broadly, and are often held up as a way to protect intellectual property as well, and trade secrets. But there are trade secret law. You can file suit under that without a non-disclosure agreement. You can also, again, require these things to be written in a very narrow way or enforced in a very narrow way. There's a lot of evidence that they're written and enforced too broadly, and also workers interpret them very broadly and are very cautious about. They're very risk averse, because the firm might have, it's much easier for the firm to have legal counsel than for the worker. So it's I don't even want to go down that road. I don't want to take on I'm actually really curious where do workers show up on that risk spectrum? Like, I guess the ones who come to you are maybe a little more, well, I don't know. I'm curious.
Ones that come to me mostly just want to know what they got themselves into.
Yeah.
And, there's not always a lot of options. Just a couple of practical thoughts. I'll start with that. I've advocated for making the courts more accessible to employees, so an employer can get in front of a judge in less than a week seeking a temporary restraining order to either stop the former employee from working for a competitor at all, or at least stopping the former employee from working with customers or whatever the restriction is. Employees can't get in front of a court that quickly, generally not. I offer one option to employees, and that's what's called a declaratory judgment action, where you're essentially asking the court to declare either that the restrictive covenant is unenforceable or that it should be narrowed. And I tell clients that you should expect about 3 months to get a decision, whereas the employer can get a decision in about a week. How many employees can afford not to work for 3 months or go do something else for 3 months? If they're going to do something else for 3 months, I mean, they might as well just stay at what they're doing or give up altogether. But so far, I haven't done that many times, maybe 5 times, and I'm batting 1,000. So I'm very selective about. It's not that I'm so brilliant. I might be brilliant, but I think it's more just that I'm careful about which ones I select. I'm not a big fan of non-competes in general. I mean, a blanket prohibition on competing within a geographic area, but in connection with the sale of a company would be an obvious example of where a non-compete is appropriate. If the employer wants to pay the employee to sit on the sideline for the period of the non-compete, that's fine too. Medtronic actually has what I think is a really great way of dealing with this. They require the employee to they pay the employee their salary, but they require the employee to go out and look for a job that is not violative of the restrictive covenant. And the former employee has to report to Medtronic periodically on their job search. And as long as they're diligently looking and they can't find a job, Medtronic will continue to pay them their full salary. If they find a job that is at less than their full salary, Medtronic will pay the difference between the job that they find and the salary that they were making before, and they do that for the period of the non-compete. I think that's a really good idea, and I've met with probably 3 or 4 employees that were under the Medtronic contract, and it works. And so I think that's one practical solution for that.
That's really cool.
So I think this conversation is really important, and I want to take a step back and ask Catherine if you could kind of tick through the major reform options that policymakers have been exploring at the state and national levels. Like, we've covered several of them, or just quickly mentioned them. So you mentioned, I think, what might be a somewhat less ambitious reform like transparency work, but then there's garden leave. If you could just kind of tick through those for us, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. And there are, many states, including this one, has taken, action over the last couple of years. I think in 2019, 29 states considered legislation to generally restrict the use of non-compete agreements. In 2020, I think it was 18 states. So this is definitely kind of increasing in terms of interest, I think, because of the research. And states are generally taking some kind of common approaches. So I think the first and probably most common is restriction, like an income restriction, essentially. So low and moderate wage workers would be essentially exempt from a non-compete. So non-competes could still be used in the case of higher wage workers. That threshold certainly differs from state to state, but often it is a worker who is earning about the median family income of a family of 4 and above would still be, a non-compete could still be used in for those workers. But anyone making less than that threshold would generally be exempt. So I think that is certainly one area of limitation, or where states have really focused, how to limit the scope of these agreements. Others have tried to limit the number, the length of time or the duration of the agreement. So moving it from 2 years, which was, I think, very common, down to 1 year, for example. I think Utah has done that. The other aspects are, garden leave for those who are still eligible for a non-compete, that the state must pay some percentage of that person's salary for the duration of the non-compete agreement. Again, trying to create that disincentive, or really making the company think twice. Is this valuable enough for me to pay that person's salary and have them sit on the sidelines or work in a different capacity or a different industry? I think another one that is more kind of court oriented, but is, I think, to Aaron's point, really important one about, it is right now there is no disincentive essentially to write these incredibly broadly. But because in many states you can go to the court and the court will just it's called a blue pencil doctrine. So they can essentially just narrow the scope of that non-compete agreement to make it more reasonable and go from there. But red pencil doctrine, which is essentially to say that if this is overly broad and harmful to the worker, then it is invalid. And so that would be definitely a preferable way to go if we're looking at restricting the use of these agreements, and the fact that there is no disincentive to write these overly broadly, pursuing more of a red pencil doctrine versus blue pencil. And I think Wisconsin has a red pencil doctrine. That is, I think, a best practice that states are looking at as well. Let's see. I think I have a whole list, because there's quite a lot. But I mean, public enforcement, private right of action, really enforcing penalties in a meaningful way to disincentivize this behavior, limiting even certain classes of, so people who are hourly wages. I think in Massachusetts, they limited interns, and people who are on more of an hourly wage base. So people who are under 25, I think in Massachusetts are also, if you can make sense, you have a huge university contingency there. So it doesn't usually make a lot of sense for anyone under 25 to probably be bound by a non-compete. So that's another area where this could be really meaningful. And I think the other thing, and something that we've kind of touched on, but I think is really just maddening in some cases, there are states that where non-competes are unenforceable, and yet workers are still required to sign them. They are still included in the contract. California is one of these states. It is kind of often upheld as this it's always been, non-competes have always been unenforceable. It's what, in part has contributed to Silicon Valley and the knowledge transfer and, kind of flow within the technology industry. And yet about 45% of California workers are still have a non-compete agreement that they sign in their contracts. They don't necessarily know that this is unenforceable. And so it still has that chilling effect on their mobility, even though that, those agreements mean nothing, in the state, except in the sale of a business or the dissolution of a partnership, which are the two common exemptions, even for the 3 states, California included, that kind of blanketly restrict the use of non-compete agreements. Banning the requirement for workers to sign unenforceable agreements. DC included this in their recent kind of partial ban as well. So I think that covers some of the main core tenets of what states are looking at pursuing. And then I'm happy to talk about federal changes too, but maybe we can come back to that. So.
Yeah, when I started writing about non-compete policy, folks would reach out asking if I knew what the situation was with respect to some particular issue they were dealing with. And one person emailed saying that her daughter was an intern and had been asked to sign a non-compete. And I was reminded of that when you mentioned interns, that this is a position that is explicitly for the purpose of getting you into a better job, providing you training and experience that allows you to then go on to bigger and better things.
Yeah, make that make sense. How are you limiting somebody's ability to compete in the industry that they're trying to gain expertise in from the very get-go? So.
Exactly. So it's a complicated issue with a lot of pieces like this. In the last panel,
could I jump?
Please.
I think the California example is really a great one too, because the whole premise of this is that it's going to allow innovation, that it's going to allow firms to share these secrets with their workers and drive innovation. But in California, it's unenforceable. You can't do this. And that's where we've seen this huge flourishing of innovation. And it's been driven a lot by people who gained expertise at one job and then started their own firm, or there's a lot of cross fertilization. The Twin Cities also has this big like managerial labor market where there's a bunch of Fortune 500 companies, there's a bunch of other private big firms and small and medium-sized organizations where people move around between these organizations and transfer ideas and knowledge, and that's like really essential to the health of innovation and the economy. So that's a great, thanks for bringing that up.
And I think, Massachusetts and California are often compared in this way. Both, have these great universities, you would imagine like immense talent pools, deep talent pools. But because Massachusetts has generally been a very, non-competes are highly enforceable there versus California, that's often been a point of comparison of like, why is the Massachusetts tech, scene not as robust as California's, and often their use of non-competing agreements is kind of one of the factors there. So
in the last panel, we talked about sort of policy and practice with respect to licensing. How can we change the rules in ways that would make the system better, and then how can we work within the existing rules to support workers? And I'm kind of want to ask a similar question of you, Chris. That I'm curious how your clients can be helped within the existing system. So, is there a role for worker advocates, for organizations, nonprofits to provide information or other kinds of assistance? And any thoughts you have on that would be appreciated.
They should probably just come see me, I guess. Would be the best thing to do. I'm sure there is. I wish there were more. I'm not personally aware of advocacy groups that are helping in this area. I mean, the level of, I guess, ignorance that employees have, not only about the contract they sign, but just about these covenants and their rights and what the options are, and all of that is, it's sad, really, because they don't feel like they have any options. So, I wish I had better ideas on how to help them get more access to information. And I'd like to see advocacy groups. I kind of feel like maybe there are more pressing things. I mean, I'm not saving the planet, but I can tell you for sure that employees that come to me, like I said, they're incredibly relieved and they need help. And so I'm not sure what the answer for that is, but there needs to be something for them.
I mean, I hear your comments, and it seems to me to point to the importance of both transparency about these contracts, how they're actually enforced, to deal with that chilling effect that's come up in this panel, but also, just the importance of representation here, which unfortunately probably can't provide to every possible every worker who might need it. So I think it is now a good moment to ask if folks in the audience have questions. And again, we'll have folks with mics, so please do wait until that comes your way. There's a question up here.
Three questions up here.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Elliot Payne. I am use he, him pronouns. I represent Ward 1 on Minneapolis City Council, and a lot of this discussion is at the state and federal level. I'm curious about what remedies there might be at a municipal level of jurisdiction.
I believe that cities could try to limit this and regulate it the way that states do it. I don't
know any reason why they couldn't.
I think there's only, it's a little harder. There may be some extra costs because you don't control as big a terrain, and so there might be some incentives for employers to move or something. But it's really hard for me to imagine that would this would be the marginal make the difference that would push somebody out.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with kind of more local governments kind of pushing remedies for abusive use of non-competes, but I would definitely encourage you to look into it.
Happy to try to help.
Exactly, same. Yeah. So
my understanding, the only city I'm aware of that's addressed this is Washington, D.C., which did enact a reform. And my understanding, I think this is a really interesting question. And my understanding from talking to folks with actual legal expertise who work on this area is that it is entirely possible to limit non-competes in much the same way that minimum wages can be raised at the municipal level, subject to some of the practical considerations you mentioned. But it's such a new issue. I think that in some ways it's not something that I think municipalities have yet tried to address.
Yeah, I mean, coming from DC, I probably should have remembered that DC did do that, but they, yeah, I mean, and DC is such an odd bird a little bit in terms of the kind of how it works, being a, city, but also kind of a pseudo state, not yet state, but, so, but yeah, I mean, we have worked with folks who have worked with the DC City Council to, I believe their ban will come into effect, I think it's this month. And there was a lot of iterations of that. It was a full ban at first, has become a partial ban that's more banned on income thresholds. But we worked with the DC City Council on that, and know folks who did as well. So I'd be happy to connect with you afterward on if there's some applicability. Again, DC is a little bit odd, kind of city-state-ish, but I think there could be some transferable knowledge there.
I know there were other questions right here, but I'm not sure who was next. So hopefully I think we'll be able to get to all of them.
I was not next, but I'll go. So I've heard a couple times people say they feel like they don't have any options when signing a non-compete. And are they in fact correct? Do they not have any options? If a non-compete clause shows up in an employment contract, my assumption is that if they don't want to sign that piece of the clause, that they are in fact not going to be offered the job. Is there any research about or knowledge about the success of somebody saying, this is too broad, I'll sign this, but it's got to be narrowed, or some other like pre-employment negotiation? And if that's successful or not.
There's no pre-employment negotiation. There's no negotiation period. You sign it and take the job, or you don't sign it and you don't get the job, period. I mean, that's not true probably at an executive level. Of course, obviously there's more leverage there and probably more perceived value for the company, but just in terms of your average employee, it's an ultimatum. You sign the contract and get a job, don't sign it, you don't get a job.
Evan Starr has done some research surveying workers about their experience with like when did they sign it? Did they sign it? When did they know that they were going to be asked to sign it? Did they know 2 weeks before they were supposed to sign it? Like, did they get a copy of their agreement in advance that they could then like prepare negotiating? Not that it would be successful, but like at least do they have a fighting, like, is it in the realm of possibility that they could know and anticipate that they would be asked to sign it and then like prepare some strategy to deal with that? And it's like a very small share of people who know about it in advance. A lot of people find out, like they sign it, but they don't even know they signed it. And they learn about the fact that they signed it from a letter or a conversation on exit when the employer says, hey, good luck out there. By the way, you can't find another job in the place where you have been working. So Evan Starr has done some work, and there's more, and he looks at bargaining, and he looks at, is there like, are they able to get raises based on this, and things like that.
Yeah, I think I wrote down a statistic from that paper. I think it was 29% were asked to sign a non-compete agreement after accepting the job. So basically, you've given up all your other options at that point, but before you start your first day, but you've already given up that bargaining power, that negotiation, opportunity. And so that is why I think the transparency mechanisms in concert with some of the other limitations that we've talked about are really critical, from a reform perspective, making sure that somebody is aware, 2 weeks before they start their job or before they sign their contract, that clause is included, I think is really imperative. I mean, it would really do a lot. It's a simple fix that would do a lot to, I think, curb a lot of the abuses, of non-compete agreements and potentially be able to at least negotiate for a higher salary or additional benefits if you know that you're going to sign that. I guess, maybe people could retain representation ahead of time and see if it's overly broad or not, but that would probably be, you would know better, but I would feel like that would maybe be a harder thing to do, but at least perhaps negotiate for some additional benefit in favor or, as an exchange.
Just in Minnesota, case law is very clear that the employer has to provide the prospective employee with a copy of the non-compete agreement before they accept employment. So typically employers that do it right, they send an offer letter. Part of the conditions in the offer are you must sign the attached non-compete agreement so that the employee, at least in Minnesota, it's good.
Yeah.
The employee, before the employee gives notice to their current employer and accepts the job, they have to have been given a copy and an opportunity to review that. And, they hardly ever do, but at least the opportunity to review it with counsel. Also in Minnesota, so you cannot give an employee a non-compete midstream in the employment unless you provide what's called independent consideration, which is something of value over and above, a normal pay increase. Unfortunately, the case law says that the courts aren't really supposed to look at whether that independent consideration is enough. And so $500 or $1,000 might be enough to support a non-compete that's signed midstream in the employment. And again, if you're employed and your employer makes an ultimatum, sign this non-compete and I'll pay you $500 or $1,000, which, it isn't much, or you're out of a job, what are you going to do? So it's not really that helpful to say that independent consideration is required.
Thank you. Very interesting and informative section. So appreciate that. To the extent that employers invest more in human capital where there is a non-compete, that is, they learn more about the business, they put more money into training these people, knowing that they can't go anywhere else. Is there any evidence, or do you see any of that taking place in the organizations that you work with?
My sense, so again, like there is a growing literature on the effects of these kind of agreements on wages and mobility and things like that. And I don't think there's any, I think the effects are not huge. They're, on the order of a few percent, sometimes none, sometimes positive in some subgroups like higher wage workers, but negative but negative effects, especially for lower wage workers. So I think there are examples, and there is reason to think that the good version of the non-compete, that it will shelter this partnership of trust and lead to higher productivity that can then benefit both parties. That's the ideal. There's some evidence for that in some circumstances, but I don't think it's broad, and I don't think it's a lot of other people are getting harmed to create that space.
Yeah.
Can I just say, in some ways, it's a kind of underpowered argument, I think, for non-competes, just because really any restriction on worker bargaining power might have the same effect, right? If employers are getting more of the benefits of the relationship, they might invest more. And we don't usually, I think of that as a reason to try to deliberately suppress worker bargaining power.
Justin Hollis, Wilder Research. It's pretty clear that limitations on the success of Minnesota workers aren't necessarily limitations on the success of their employers. And so my question is really about reconciling this apparent paradox. Before the pandemic, and I think now, this conversation about Minnesota's workforce shortage is returning. And so I'm curious if the panel has any comments about the idea that there are nearly 2 job openings for every job seeker in Minnesota, and how, and I'll ask somebody from Deed to sort of weigh in on that, how these apparent limitations are being seen through that lens.
It's a great question. I don't know of anyone who's looked at that carefully. So the prediction would be that in places where there's more non-competes, it's harder to fill vacancies because, like there's less potential applicants are restricted. I think it's a really interesting theory. I don't know evidence about it. It's a great question. I don't know.
Yeah, similarly, I don't know that that's been quite studied yet, but I think your question is a good one in that, in the current economic circumstances we're in, where we do have labor shortages, where, that is very much what, many localities and communities are experiencing, putting restrictions on the labor market, on the ability for people to move, to jobs. And I think this was definitely apparent in Oregon. So in 2008, a law went into effect that essentially restricted the use of non-compete agreements for lower wage workers. And the mobility, once that law took into effect in terms of people moving from job to job, was incredibly high, kind of indicating that there was really pent-up demand for moving into, between positions, obviously, hopefully to get higher wages and to reap other benefits within the labor market. That is, I think, what we should be aiming for, especially now that we're in a tighter labor market where there are labor shortages, and we should be allowing people the freedom to kind of fill positions that are a better fit for them, that fit their, in some cases their expertise, or just better fit their lifestyle where they live, obviously seeking better wages. So I think non-competes, especially in light of the pandemic, in light of the labor market that we're currently in part as a result of that, it makes the case even stronger, for reforming the use of these agreements. There's the obvious use case of, this is a bit outside of the scope of your question, but physicians are under non-compete agreements. I mean, that just makes so little sense right now, considering the immense shortage that we're experiencing, for coming out of a public health crisis. But of course, across the labor market, we're experiencing shortages and crunches in this way. And so I think the last few years makes the case even stronger for relooking at the nature of these agreements for all workers.
We have time for just one more question.
Thank you. So we work for my colleague left. We work for an organization that coaches new Americans, immigrants, and refugees. We don't get trained on this. We don't offer this great, important, certainly culturally based training. Are there resources that you all can recommend for us to share with folks before they, as part of their U.S. job search, to learn about these?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I think that's a really important aspect, especially because research has generally shown too that for women and non-white workers, I think there's a twice the negative effect on wages as for white workers or white men who sign non-competes. And so obviously it's really important that especially these more vulnerable populations are aware of what they could be getting into. So, I mean, I know that the National Employment Law Project, NELP, is a great resource. And I would definitely, I'm sure they have a lot of resources as well there. But I know they've been very active on this issue, especially from the worker perspective. So I would definitely recommend there as a starting place, but you have other thoughts too.
There's like some network advocacy group, or like, I want to say EARN, but I'm not sure that's right. Yeah, I don't know. I'll try to find it.
Okay. Yeah, we can.
I'm
happy to connect afterward too. But thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Well, so one more quick question. Sure, I think we can. If folks can hang around for another few minutes.
I think I did a little bit of the answer to this with the research on the impact, the disproportionate impact. But I know at the beginning you talked about the impact on, workers making under $20 an hour. But I was just sort of, I didn't hear as clearly, like the Jimmy John's case. How often is that brought to court, or how often do people fall through on that, or how much is that just a perceived reality for those workers? I'm trying to understand a little bit more of like, what does this feel like for a worker making under $20 an hour who actually signs non-compete like that? Like, what does that look like, and how can we understand that better so we understand the impact it has?
I don't see that. I mean, that's a very extreme example. I've heard the Jimmy John, I think President Biden used the Jimmy John's example. I don't think by and large non-competes are being implemented at that level. Certainly with low income workers, and I have represented a number of low income workers that have no business making them sign a non-compete. But one of the things that I talk about with clients is, what do you know about the company's previous enforcement? Do they do it aggressively? Do they negotiate? Do they let people leave? And a lot of times it just has to do with the employer and how aggressive they are. There's a real estate broker. I won't say who he is. His face is plastered all over billboards all over the state of Minnesota. Might give you some idea of who he is. I've represented maybe three. He has a 3-year non-compete to be a real estate broker. Come on, buddy. You don't need to tie your real estate brokers to a 3-year non-compete. And those are among the 1,000% that it hasn't taken the smile off his face on the billboards, but hopefully eventually it will. But in any event, I mean, that's very aggressive, and it's kind of all over the board.
I'll say, well, I don't know the statistics on, how often these, those cases in particular are litigated. The stories that you hear from folks who are lower or moderate, income earners, in the case of actually there were testimony for HF 9999 or 999 here, but also in just in other settings, it is just so striking how, obviously these workers are the ones that are, losing everything in certain cases, just having the most just horrific kind of impacts, on their livelihood, on their ability to work and provide for their families. Those it's hard to make a case for the use of non-compete agreements when you hear that. And so, from an advocacy perspective, we are really trying to shed light on those stories. And I think that's a really important aspect because, again, there's not the understanding, they're only becoming an understanding within the research. But a lot of people are really kind of concerned about sharing this, maybe because they've also signed an NDA in some cases. And so it's harder to glean some of those impacts and those stories. But when they are out there, those anecdotes are incredibly powerful in shedding light on how abusive these agreements are. And I think that has led to, in part, some of the bipartisan support. So it would be like just the one thing I would love to reiterate too. This has typically been seen as an issue that Democrats have championed and Republicans have not. But we're seeing kind of a sea change a little bit on that. Certainly at the federal level, there's bipartisan legislation to almost wholly restrict the use of non-compete agreements except for those narrow circumstances. And I think the storytelling aspect of, showing how not only pervasive these are, but also how detrimental these can be to the livelihoods of, hardworking Americans has really there's become a consensus on the need to figure out how can we think through some of the cobbling together some of the reforms that we talked about earlier to make sure that these are not used in the way that they currently are. So
that's a great note to end this. That unfortunately does end our panels, but fortunately doesn't end our event. So we're going to head up to lunch. I hope everyone here will join us for that and continue these discussions on the subject of this panel, but also the prior one. We'll have folks who will be helping guide you to where lunch will be. It'll be just upstairs. But thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you especially to the folks here at Community Development who have done all the work to make this event work so smoothly. And thanks very much to our panelists. So really appreciate it.